Welcome back to Channel Water. In the past videos, we have looked at how water is invisible to our eyes, how that has affected our theories of evolution and nature, what is active, what is passive, where consciousness is. And now in this video, we are going to look even closer into how water is the body of consciousness.
Every one of water's properties is unique, and they do not easily fit into the generally accepted laws of physics. Science has not yet been able to answer the question of why water is the only substance on the planet that can exist in three states: liquid, solid, and gaseous. Why does water have the highest surface tension of all liquids? Why is it the most powerful solvent on Earth? And how, in defiance of the Earth's gravity, is water able to rise through the trunks of gigantic trees against tens of atmospheres of pressure?
We don't know what consciousness is. We don't know what water is. We don't know where any of them came from. But when we try to learn about consciousness, we mainly look at people. Maybe there are other structures of water, structures of consciousness in nature that we can use and examine to understand consciousness.
There are many different types of intelligent life on our own planet. For example, plants. That may sound ridiculous, but if you grade intelligence based on a species' communication system and their ability to populate a planet, plants would be considered by many scientists as an intelligent species.
Why does it sound ridiculous? When we look at plants, we don't really know what their function is for most of them, and we assume that it's ridiculous to give them any kind of intelligence or intention. Plants must be so offended by us. I mean, it's really bad. Our lack of understanding of plants doesn't help us in solving the issues around consciousness, life, how life started and came to be. I wonder what Darwin thinks about it.
Charles Darwin, who passionately studied plants through most of his life, thought of them like upside-down animals, where their thinking organ was at the root and their sexual organs were on top. That may sound ridiculous.
So where did this idea come from? That plants and animals are unconscious, that nature is soulless and automatic. Even Darwin himself thinks that animals and plants are not that different, that plants are thinking animals, that they have the same qualities. So I wonder, where did that come from?
For Descartes, our physiological reality was rather irrelevant to our mind, our rationality, our consciousness. This is a quote from a 1968 paper on his beast machine argument. Without minds to direct their bodily movements, animals must be regarded as unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork.
Descartes came up with a separation between mind and matter. And I think it's a good beginning to our conversation, the separation between consciousness, the thought, and the passive matter. He's trying to touch on that issue of something is active, it's conscious, and it's not the same as the passive matter. The only issue is with Descartes, he draws the line of separation in the wrong place.
In making this division between mind and matter, argued that only humans had minds and therefore moral status, while other animals didn't have minds. They were merely physiological machines or beast machines, morally equivalent to plants and to rocks.
So Descartes separates nature to those that have mind and those that don't have mind. And for him, and we can understand it was pretty early, animals are degraded to plants, plants are degraded to rocks. So basically, we dumb down everything else that is not human, assuming that consciousness is only something that humans have because we have a brain, and taking away the possibility of consciousness anywhere else. So we didn't look anywhere else. The more correct division is between, first, rock and water. Rock is the passive element, water an active element. And after that, once we have structures on this planet, the separation is between rock and mixture of rock and water, which again is active and conscious. So we can see that plants, animals, people, everything that is a vessel of water is a vessel of consciousness. So I would draw the line between the rock and then plants, animal, people. That group altogether have consciousness. Rock is just a building block of nature. We use it to build, but consciousness is the one building, whether it's plant, animal, people. It's the building block of consciousness. That is water. So we have rock and we have water.
Recent studies have shown that plant roots not only have the ability to sense soil characteristics like water, nutrients, and the availability of oxygen, but they also change their behavior based on this information. Instead of just one big brain, or root, most plants have millions of individual roots, each working together like a complex network.
As you can see, we find behavior in every element of the organic world. Even the smallest root has so much intelligence, function, efficiency, and behavior. It adjusts its behavior to the finding that it finds in the environment, which is consciousness. So when we look at trees, when we look at this type of architecture, does consciousness dwell within the architecture and becomes one with it and controls it in a local manner? Because in some ways, if a tree doesn't have a brain, I don't know what other option would be.
No one root necessary to survive. Because of this, plants have a remarkable ability to survive catastrophic events. Trees, for example, can live on even after losing 90% or more of their roots.
The tree is not dependent on one root, branch, or any piece of it. It's an entire body of consciousness that is thinking and operating in every local area. So we can see that consciousness could be more localized within the body and not just in one location, in one system, which informs the rest of the body. We can look at other animals and see this type of functions and constructions, and for us it seems completely magical when a jellyfish does this, but with a tree we accept it. Let's look at a jellyfish.
When a sexually mature jellyfish is wounded or becomes old, its cells begin to revert to its original polyp or colonial stage. In theory, this process could continue forever, meaning that there might be jellyfish who are biologically as old as the oceans themselves.
The concept of age, the cycle of life, is very different from animals to plants to us, but mainly in the way we understand it. In plants and animals, we can see that there is a possibility of being outside of that cycle, or more to say, it's an architecture. We're looking at buildings with functions and buildings that can be remodeled, regenerated, reoccupied. So we see a certain flow of consciousness of life through a building, through a material. But when we look at studies of science, the people that study the jellyfish and its structure, or the tree and its roots, are not the same people that study cognitive behavior and consciousness of the mind. Because again, we are only looking at people when we are looking at consciousness.
And a good landmark is this paper by Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, published in 1990. And they start their paper by saying that it is remarkable that most of the work in cognitive sciences and the neurosciences makes no reference to consciousness or awareness at all.
So what do scientists study when they study consciousness? What do they look at? Where is the place that they think they might find more answers and solutions?
And the author Mark Haddon put this very nicely, I think. He said the raw material of consciousness is not on the other side of the universe. It didn't happen 14 billion years ago, and it's not squirreled away deep inside an atom. The raw material of consciousness is right here, inside your head. You can hold the brain in your hands.
Consciousness is in the brain. The brain is the holy grail for science. That is the place where everything is going to be found. Everything that I am and everything that I'll ever be.
Brains. To compare this to other species, scientists came up with something called the Encephalization Quotient, or EQ. An EQ for a given species is calculated using their average brain-to-body mass ratio, compared to other similarly sized animals. It's thought of as sort of a proxy for intelligence. On the higher end, humans have an EQ of about 7.8, which means our brain is about 7.8 times larger than would be expected for our body size. The bottlenose dolphin is at 5.3, chimpanzees are at 2.5, and dogs are around 1.2. And what about whales? Whales are considered to be reasonably intelligent, and certain species, like the sperm whale, have the heaviest brains in the animal kingdom. But interestingly, the sperm whale has a measly EQ of 0.58.
Since we invented computers, we've been very confused about what consciousness or the brain is. We think that it is a computer. We try to compare it in size, how processing, memory, data, but computers have no consciousness in them or intention or purpose. That comes from the user that has made the computer. In some ways, this is where we actually do project ourselves and our technology and our understanding onto nature. This is the place that we take away the natural being that we see around us, that creative force that is in everything, plants, animal, people. So we might give too much emphasis to the brain when we don't know what it is, how it works, and we compare everything against that. So I don't think that's a good point of measurement, to use something you don't know what it is to compare to other beings, like other animals and plants, whether they have a bigger brain, no brain. Those questions apparently are not the right questions when we deal with consciousness.
To get a more accurate understanding of whales' intelligence, we'd have to compare how complex different species' communication systems are. Humans are thought to dominate the animal kingdom in this category, but whales may not be that far behind. Humpback whales, for instance, are known for their remarkably complex songs. Their mating calls, for example, have the most complex acoustic displays in the entire animal kingdom.
When we look at plants, insects, birds, fish, we see so much order and structure and choreography, coordination between those animals as they go about the world, collaborations. One must assume that communication is taking place, that there is communication that I cannot hear, detect, or see. But that doesn't mean that communication is not there. A good example for an animal that we don't necessarily understand its language, yet we have acknowledged that it is conscious, aware, and intelligent. Well, we did that because we saw that it has a big brain and we find some excuses, but let's look.
We used to think we were the only species on the planet that could think, and now we know that we're amongst many thinking species. So the questions are no longer, can they think, but how do they think? And what's amazing is, in this capacity, with giving them mirrors, it looks like they're doing a lot of things very similar to us.
Sometimes you just can't ignore nature, and that's what happened with dolphins. People realize from interacting with them that we are dealing with a conscious being, that there's somebody with awareness, behavior, complexity that we're dealing with. So then we took a step back and said, well, okay, dolphins have a big brain. Maybe that will explain it. Still, we don't understand their language or anything about their being, purpose in life, but we do know that they are aware and conscious.
And not only do they figure out that it's them, but they show interest to look at themselves. So one thing is to understand it's themselves. It's a whole other thing to say, I want to look at myself. I want to look and see what my face looks like, or what does it look like when I turn upside down and blow a bubble.
We sat in awe as this group of dolphins explored themselves before us, unable to ignore the mirror.
So this is what it took for us to acknowledge a dolphin is conscious. He needs to look in the mirror. He needs to want to look in the mirror. Maybe they need to be narcissists. We need to be able to show that they do everything that humans do. I don't understand that part, why we have to have animals or plants do what I do in order for them to be conscious. Their function in nature is different than mine, in every way. Otherwise, there wouldn't be that structure, that vehicle.
Figure this out. And what's funny is we recognize this because it's so similar to what kids do, what chimps do. I mean, it's amazing. And they go through the same stages. These are animals that have been separated from us from 95 million years of evolution. Big brains, processing things in similar ways.
So we see that consciousness is the same across the board. Even if it's separated by over 90 million years of evolution, it's still the same curious, creative energy that has that ability to constantly examine itself, its environment, and be creative about it. So what is the thing that keeps us stuck? We realized that that was the brain. But this is not helping us now because dolphins have brains. So we allow ourselves to basically say, okay, we'll take the dolphins into our category, but we'll leave a bunch out because they have big brains. So we have something in common. So let's examine this brain.
But the brain won't deliver its secrets very easily. What's extraordinary about the brain is not so much the number of neurons, though there are about 90 billion. It's not even the number of connections, though there are so many that if you counted one every second, it would take you about 3 million years to finish counting.
Looking at the brain, we can see that there are billions of connections. They all end up in a very small scale beginning point. And the brain is also two-way. The body communicates to the brain as much as the brain communicates to the body. So for some reason we are just focusing on the brain and its activity, but let's look further.
What's truly extraordinary are the patterns of connectivity which to a large extent are still not known, but within which are inscribed everything that makes you, you.
So we don't yet understand how the brain really works, how the connections are being made, and the patterns of thought, but we are quick to say that everything that I am is in the brain. Everything that I'll ever be is coded in the brain. And I think that's where we step a bit too far.
There are more neurons in your cerebellum, this bit at the back of your brain, than in the rest of your brain put together. In fact, there are about 4 times more neurons in your cerebellum than in the rest of your cortex. But if you have damage to your cerebellum, yeah, you'll have some problems with coordination and other things, some cognitive problems, but you won't lose consciousness.
So consciousness is not limited to the brain only. We can clearly see that, just like the roots of the tree. If a certain part of the brain was cut off, the rest of it is still functional, it's still happening. The only thing you lose is the ability that that section was responsible for. Now, if you compare it to yourself as a driver in a vehicle, if somebody cut off the electric nerve system to the windshield wipers, they won't work. If they cut off to your lights, to your navigation system, to pretty much everything, all those things will stop working. But you, the conscious being that is driving this vehicle, is still there. When we feel with our whole body. And this is what people have testified to, how their feelings are translated through the whole body. And for me, the main point is, why am I not my whole body? Why am I just limited to my brain, or to a nerve system, or to a code on a DNA? I am my whole body, and I feel things through my whole body. I express things with my whole body. And for me, that's really where I don't want to be reduced to just one organ. I found a few good examples of plants and animals that show us how consciousness is basically a flow that goes through matter. And the whole idea of age and life cycle is just internal categories that we use to categorize expiration dates of structures.
Some living things, when faced with a drought, do more than just survive. When water disappears, they can cheat death itself through a kind of resurrection. Look closely at this tree, baked by the California sun. It's covered in moss, and living in that moss is a microscopic animal called a rotifer. When there's no rain, the moss and the rotifers dry out. The rotifers stop eating, the mosses stop photosynthesizing. They're reduced to a pile of chemicals, and they can stay that way for years, even 100 years.
When I look at plants and I see a dead plant, or what we call a dead plant, the only thing I see is an empty house.
When the rain comes, the mosses spring back to life in seconds, using a rare ability. Right before they dried out, they wrote themselves a set of genetic instructions, so that if they ever got water again, they could start producing proteins and growing right away.
You can see how we always give the activity to the passive element, to the dead plant that is nothing but a pile of chemicals. But it's doing everything. It's writing the DNA, and it's once the water is there, it comes back to life. Water never died. Water is the one that is active, was in the plant, left the plant, and now came back. we are actually watching consciousness inhabiting a structure. We're watching life starting. This is very different from what we're used to. Our bodies are too big of a scale to be able to watch that moment happen. When we decompose, that takes a much longer span of time because we're talking about 60, 70 trillion cells. But those plants are not that different from single family homes. And you watch the individual families go back into their spaces and reoccupy it.
Well, here's the inside of a blade of grass. See those tiny tubes around the perimeter? Those are for moving water up from its roots. But mosses don't have roots. Their porous cells absorb water like a sponge whenever it's available.
In a case of a plant like this, such small in scale, with a very simple structure, it's like a sponge. So that means that basically we have lots of row houses, and each molecule of water can find and go back into each one of the cells directly. So it's not a bigger system like a plant that has roots and it draws the water from the ground and transports them to their cells. Here it's immediate. The rain comes, they go in, reoccupy, and they start harvesting the sun.
When it rains, the water activates the rotifer's metabolism, and they need to fuel up.
So it's the water that metabolizes. It's the water that is moving through the plants. It is architecture for water. We see that in every point of the system, the active force that brings this house and machines into life is water.
They use the crown of cilia on their head to create a current, to suck in all the algae and bacteria they can. They grind this food up with their jaws. See the jaws? They look like a tiny beating heart.
So when we talk about machines in nature, this is the machine. And somebody is using that machine. You can see the behavior, and you can see how intelligent it is in its ability to find the food, cut the material down. We're really looking at a machine that has a pump at its head to pull and suck material in, and then it has those jaws that are just cutting the material up to be used further. Everything we're looking at are things that we cannot recreate, not in our scale or their scale. These machines and all of this architecture is something that we can't take lightly as random appearances in nature. They're nothing but a very well-calculated design, a beautiful, efficient machines of nature. But when I say machine, I mean machine, an extension of water to use and to be used out in nature. All those homes, all those vehicles are extension of water's technology to use and manipulate the world around it.
Plants dominate animals on land with more than 1,000 times the amount of biomass. So, if world domination was a numbers game, plants would beat animals 1,000 to 1.
The importance of analyzing all of those plants as architecture is because it can give you an insight into the dweller and designer. You can start understanding the scale in which we need to examine life, the scale in which water is operating, and the fact that you are a giant. In some way, we have again that barrier where we can't see water, we don't think of water as being active or doing anything. And when you combine that with the seamless technology that water has, once it occupies a structure, it becomes seamless, the being of the water and the behavior and actions of that structure. But when the structure dries out, when water leaves the vehicle or leaves the house, you can see that that structure will be passive forever, hundreds of years, until water comes back.
They have muscles, they have a nervous system, so they're similar to us in that way. They're like insects in that they have that hard shell skin, which they reproduce with eggs, and then they molt their skin, and they use their whole body to facilitate digestion. We don't really know how they evolved. We can't even guess. We don't know what other species they're related to.
Water bears have always been one of my favorite creatures or inventions of nature. It's almost like a diving suit. It's something between a second skin, a clothing for water. As it enters in it, it can occupy the whole body and use it and move around. The metabolism, everything is happening within the whole body. It's not about organizations, brain. It's really just like putting a special suit on that gives you the ability to do what the beautiful water bears do.
What are some of the most interesting facts about them?
They are #1 extremophile. In fact, that means they can live in extreme places. They can live in really cold climates, they can live in hot springs, they can go in outer space. They sent some on one of the NASA flights and they even had babies up in space. So they're just totally able to go in a little ball sometimes, which is called cryptobiosis, and then stay in that stage for even over 100 years. We've been able to find them in dried plant collections that are over 100 years old by putting a drop of water on them and having them come back to life.
To bring anything back to life, you just need to add water.
The lifespan of a tardigrade, if it was just moving around in the water and you were observing it, might be only 6 months, but because it dries out, rehydrates, dries out, rehydrates, dries out, rehydrates, this could be done over a period of many, many years. You know, this is how they preserve themselves. Sometimes they can be 100 years old that way.
So again, we're watching another structure comes back to life once water is introduced. So what is active? Is the structure of this little animal active? Is it the water that brings back this animal to life? Are we again watching consciousness as it's reviving a structure of soil, a passive structure? So if water was active before and it's active again once it's in the structure, but that structure was never active without water. We're going to get a bit conceptual here, but I think that might be the way to really understand. Within the laws of physics, there's no such thing as something coming out of nothing. It's harder, I think, to explain a being going out and in of consciousness. Basically meaning that consciousness turns on and off. Once you achieve a certain brain, consciousness appears. If the brain is damaged or your body is dead, consciousness is off. It makes more sense physically that consciousness is, always is, in a constant, inherent state of life, alive. It is inherently alive. And that material, water, goes in and out of structures, which gives you the appearance of things coming to life and dying. So we saw within animals and plants, that cycle is not life and death, on and off. It's a cycle of continuity. Consciousness is continually flowing through the matter. For us, it's not that different. I am physically attached to the first human being on this planet. Physically. There was never a tear between us. And it's not just in DNA. Physically, I came out of my mother's body. I'm an extension of her body. She's an extension of the one before. And not only that, we transfer actual cells from the mother to the baby. So I could carry cells that goes back to the first human being on this planet. So the idea of life and death, even in humans, is a big misconception. It makes more sense, mathematically, physically, that consciousness is. Always is, and it goes in and out of structures.
I've seen a couple of the headlines use the word alien DNA, but it's not really alien DNA,
I know.
right?
I think that was to get your attention.
Yeah. I definitely clicked on those links.
Right, and I did check on that too, and the foreign means it's not water bear DNA, it's probably algae that they live with, or it could be fungi that's in the droplets of water that they're kind of floating in and in the neighborhood of their environment, but certainly not their own DNA, which is kind of cool.
There's more flexibility in nature than what we think or are used to. When you look at that scale, the water bear, in a sense, it's like a vehicle, and then it's not different from somebody adding solar panels on their vehicle. So for us, solar panels are considered as plant DNA, but the reality is that if water wants to, it can install solar panels in a water bear. That is just something it can do. We know that water can design DNA, and it can also use it across platforms. That is evolution. That's why the map of evolution is correct, and that map shows you how DNA has been coded, designed, evolved, and constantly getting better for the purposes it's being used for.
The wood frog has an astounding ability. It can produce antifreeze. This seemingly ordinary amphibian can survive at temperatures as low as 3 degrees Fahrenheit, and then come back to life.
We know that biology is dependent on many different chemical processes, and those are dependent on temperature. So when you draw that of the activity within nature, the activity of consciousness, one thing you can see is that the warmer it is, the faster the activity is. The colder it is, the slower the activity is. So for consciousness, time and temperature is one unit. You can slow down time or you can move it faster. So we have consciousness as a constant in nature, and then the only variable is temperature, how active or inactive consciousness is.
The wood frog enters a state of suspended animation. Its internal organs and metabolic activity grind to a near halt. The lungs stop working, and the heart eventually stops beating. The wood frog can survive for months, with an incredible 2/3 of their body completely frozen.
The frog is able to keep the cell structure intact while being frozen. Because that is the only reason we can't freeze ourselves and come back to life.
After a grueling 8 months, spring arrives. The temperature's warm and the ice starts to melt. Water slowly flows back into his cells. They rehydrate and return to their original shape. Within 30 minutes, the heart restarts and the blood begins to flow.
It's beautiful to watch the water go back, reoccupy the frog, turn the heart back on, the metabolism system, the blood, and you see the frog really coming back to life. We're watching a real resurrection of structure in a sense. We will have an entire video that explains how time and temperature is the same unit. I think this is enough for now. But what we really want to look at is how does this affect the way that we think about consciousness, and does it help us with all of our questions about consciousness? If we take on the idea that consciousness is a driver of all those vehicles, that consciousness is always on, it's always alive. But the only difference is whether it's inside of architecture or not, and what the temperature is.
We should not be afraid of naturalizing consciousness. It's not a bad thing to understand its basis in the material world. As so often in science, with greater understanding comes a larger sense of wonder and a greater realization that we are part of and not apart from the rest of nature.
We work so hard to prove that we are part of nature. I haven't seen anyone prove the opposite. That will be harder, to show me that I'm not part of the system around me. But I think that with water, we can help people see that they're part of nature if they do have a sense of detachment or division from the environment around them. Water is that unifying field, that fabric that connects us all, not only plant and animal, but really to even the environment around you. Thank you for joining us on this long journey. But I think you will leave here today with a better understanding of what consciousness is, what the possibilities for consciousness are, and the fact that consciousness can actually be tangible and magical. It can be infinite and personal. It is always there, it is active, but the changes of temperature changes its activity. If we are truly the part of a global consciousness, so many people do talk and believe in the concept of a global consciousness. So we are a drop of water in a bigger cloud of thought that is happening here. We see that in the bigger patterns of cities and countries and what we do as the bigger body. So please go out to the world, find out for yourself. What is active? What is passive? In what things do you see consciousness? And is it possible for you that water would be the architect of nature?
Maybe in the future, we'll think of a better way to search for all possible forms of intelligent life. For now, we'll have to stick to the kinds of aliens that act like us.
You want some water? All right.